So this session is DD317 Advancing Social Psychology. Stephanie Taylor, Paul Stenner and David Kaposi, welcome. I'm delighted that you're here to talk to us about this module, and I know that many students are excited about it. But Stephanie, I wonder if we could start with a brief overview just about some of the specifics about the module.
Right. Well, this is a module that people will be taking at level 3. And we wanted, this might sound a bit paradoxical, but we wanted to make it a simple module because it's likely to be sandwiched for many psychology students between whatever they did at last at level 2 and between a big dissertation module. And so we wanted this, because we knew we were dealing with fairly experienced students, we wanted this to be a straightforward module which gives people the opportunity to pursue their own interests to a great extent. So it's got 5 blocks, it's got 5 TMAs.
And you've got an ICMA popped in the middle as well as a different form of assessment also. Yeah. So what are the entry requirements and access? You mentioned that this would be something for third-level psychology students and it's included in the BPS recognised BSc Social Psychology. That's right. Who's going to be interested in it though? Well,
it's also included in the BSc Psychology. Who's going to be interested? Well, social psychology is a very well recognised field in psychology. It's of particular interest to people who want to understand why psychological issues, the use of psychology in the social world and so on, why that's not just a matter of pathologising individuals in a rather medical way and going and looking for what's wrong with individuals. It's for people who understand that we are always, in great part, the product of our contexts. The kinds of people we are now is very different to the kinds of people we were 100 years ago, or in other cultures in the big sense of, socio-historical periods. And so it's for people who want to find out how the psychology they've studied goes out into the world, how it impacts on the world, and how it's also in large part the product of that world. So this is about, to use a term that we adopt a lot, it's about the social individual interface. And we anticipate that most of the students will be from a psychology background, but I think this will also be a module that might interest people with a more sociological background who feel that they would like to come into psychology perhaps a bit more from an applied area, or as I say, from sociology, or maybe even geography, or another sort of socially focused area.
Now, it's a blended approach that you've got. So you've got the textbooks, and there's also the online activities and material.
Yeah. Yes, so let me show you the textbook.
Hot off the press.
Hot off the press, the cover. I don't have the actual book yet. In fact, there are 2 textbooks. It's one large book which is divided into 2 volumes. And the study sequence will be, as most of the modules are now, it will be centred online. And we've used the online environment obviously for reinforcement activities, for all those kind of basic things that you need for, the kind of calendar which moves you through week by week. But we've also used it as the base on which we've put lots of interviews with academics, because we wanted to show how people's personal interests and identities cross over into their academic work. So we could begin, for example, by asking a lot of our academic contributors, what's your personal interest in what you do? Why did you start doing it? And then coming from that, how does it go out and impact on the larger world? So that's probably the overview of the materials, audiovisual material on the online environment. The textbooks, we've given quite a lot of links outward to other material, and we give people quite a lot of independent study time where we ask them to keep going outwards and looking.
Lovely. Thank you, Stephanie. I want to talk about some of the ways that this is applied, because you've mentioned some of the things that have driven the academics around it. And if I could just sort of briefly mention the 4 blocks, which are the social psychology for contemporary society, new encounters across cultures in a globalised world, contemporary citizenship, action and participation, and contemporary social psychological subjects.
Yes. Well, basically, we've said it's a changing social psychology for a changing world. The world's changing, people are changing, the study of people needs to be changing. But that's not all one way. Psychology goes outwards and changes the world. The world changes people, but then the changes in the world require that social psychology itself changes. So we're looking at that dynamic interplay all the way. And some of the contemporary issues that we focus on, they include the kind of, well, the state of the nation, really. We talk about neoliberalism, we talk about globalisation, we talk about immigration, we talk about multiculturalism. We talk about the identities of people today. So we talk about gender, changing meanings of gender, new femininities, new masculinities. We talk about conflict because, unfortunately, it's very difficult to talk about the world today without talking about conflict. And we talk about an area which might seem less social, which is the kind of area of positive psychology, and Paul will talk about that in a moment. But that's a very good example of this interplay between psychology, social psychology as disciplines, and the world which they kind of appear to start from, but in fact, in a funny feedback way, act on as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stephanie. That's a really sort of brief outline about the module, the blocks, and some of the key themes. And I wonder if we could pick up on some of that because, as usual, these sessions never have quite as much time as I would like to talk about some of these issues. David, I wonder if you can tell us about your area of interest and just sort of give us an example. You wanted to talk a bit about violence and conflict.
Yeah, so Steph mentioned that conflict is an important social issue for us now. Funnily enough, around 2.5 decades ago, with the kind of collapse of communism, fall of the Berlin Wall, there was an idea that actually there's not going to be much conflict in the future. There is this prevailing liberal order, and we kind of people in the world will, at some point in the future, near future perhaps, kind of negotiate in a reasonable and rational manner whatever differences they have. Now, looking back, it sounds, of course, very naive, because it is quite clear after these 2.5 decades that conflict is here to stay. There are kind of intractable international conflicts, like the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which is one we pick up in the book, actually. There are re-emerging conflicts, say the one between Russia and Ukraine. There are conflicts which I don't think anyone really foresaw, which is Brexit. But also the emergence of the far right, Donald Trump, these kind of issues. Now, why does conflict seem to be so persistent, and violent conflict in particular? Well, there can be many explanations to this question, but one way to think about it, which comes from the tradition of psychoanalysis, which is my personal interest, is to think of people as essentially conflicted from inside. Conflicted beings. So rather than being surprised that conflict is with us, start thinking of it in terms of how we are conflicted inside and how we deal with those internal conflicts. And to think about societal conflict with reference, not exclusive reference, but partly with reference to individual personal conflicts. This would be some sort of psychoanalytic approach to social psychology. And this will form one block in this module, the fifth block, where we think about these issues from a psychoanalytic point of view.
Excellent. So dealing with some quite big issues there. Paul, you've written chapter 12 of the book, which is called Happy Subjects and Humaneering, a contemporary subject. So that's an interesting title.
Yes, well, the block title is a contemporary subject, and we were interested in this idea that the way in which people are, our experiences, our psychologies are not universal. They change from historical moment to historical moment. And so this idea, the title, a contemporary subject, has got a dual meaning. I'll talk about the second meaning in a minute, but the first meaning of a contemporary subject is just that the topic of happiness, which I focus on in this chapter, is of the now. It's of the moment. It's something that's contemporary, and it's contemporary in a couple of senses. You might say that people have forever been interested in their own happiness, and I'm sure that's probably true. There's a sense in which there's something timeless about it. But there's two recent developments that make it contemporary. One is a development of a new approach to psychology, a new school of psychology over the last 10 or 15 years that Steph briefly mentioned, which is positive psychology. And positive psychology sort of tells the story of itself as being a sort of radical departure from previous types of psychology. So it points out that sort of in its classic incarnation, psychology always focuses on the negative. It's about delinquency, it's about deviance, it's about psychopathology, it's about children who wet the bed or who can't write. It's about negative things. So have a problem, call in a psychologist. And positive psychologists take the view that it's much better to focus on the positive aspects of what they call human flourishing. So they've put happiness as right at the centre of the agenda of psychology. And at the same time, during the same period, governments, corporations throughout the world have become interested in happiness, in collecting data about the happiness of their populations or the happiness of their workforce, and using that data to make decisions about their policies or about their strategies. So happiness has become part of the way in which we're governed today, and this goes hand in hand with the development of this approach to psychology. So we found that an interesting thing to focus on.
The other area you talk about is human subjectivity.
Yes.
So this is an interesting idea.
Yes, this is, I suppose, the second meaning of the contemporary subject, this idea that we explore in the module, which is, I think, a very exciting idea, that human subjectivity, by which we mean our own experiences of ourselves from our first-person perspective, our thoughts, our feelings, our internal life, that our subjectivity is something that changes in different historical moments, in different social settings. It's as if we used to think of human beings as sort of complete, and you would describe them objectively as psychologists, whereas now we start to think of the human being as sort of incomplete and completed by the social context to some extent. And what's also interesting, and what we explore, is the idea that psychology as a discipline doesn't just describe what people are, it also sort of provides ways of thinking about what we might become. It influences the way in which we act and the way in which we think about ourselves.
So is this what you mean by, you mentioned the word humaneering earlier?
Yeah, humanism. It's a strange.
Is this a term you've invented?
We didn't coin it. It comes actually from a social psychology textbook, mid-20th century, from the States. But the word grabbed me and my colleagues so much that we decided we would use it, because it's a pun, of course, on engineering. And just as in the physical sciences you would get knowledge about the physical world that you would then apply via engineering, the idea that social psychology conventionally, traditionally had of itself was a sort of humaneering discipline. You come up with objective scientific knowledge in the laboratory, and then you apply that to change people's conduct and way of thinking and way of feeling in order to, in some way, improve or enhance that conduct. But of course, this raises some kinds of ethical issues about, who says what it is that people should be like, who gives us the ideal that we're aspiring to in our humaneering activity. And in some ways, nowadays social psychology is being used in some ways that are quite problematic. So you might have been aware in the recent US elections, for example, but also in the referendum around Brexit, a lot of social psychology knowledge was used to influence the way in which people voted, quite explicitly designed to manipulate people's voting habits. And this used data, for example, gathered from Facebook, using the fact that lots of people are on Facebook to get lots of data about personality types and to correlate that with online behaviour, the kinds of things people like, for example. And in this way, social psychological knowledge was used to sort of, in a very tailored way, to influence people who were perceived to be sort of on the cusp, not quite knowing exactly what they were going to vote. And a lot of this was sponsored by one side rather than the other. So this, I think, illustrates some of the controversy at play in this mission of trying to humaneer people. Who says in which direction people should be taken.
Oh, some very current issues and very, very topical ones. Stephanie, I wonder if we could end by talking about the blog, because the psychology team do a blog, and we've been spending a bit of time talking throughout today about how students can subscribe to these blogs as a way of both engaging with the academic community and having really nice current bite-sized bits of information. Now, your blog, and we'll show you the link for this, and you can also get that link on the resources page of the website. Your latest edition was about Theresa May eating chips, and you were talking here about performing identity, a very interesting piece.
Yes, I mean, we're having fun with the blog because we want to show how social psychology comes out and applies to the world that we're living in now. The next post actually will be on voting. But I had fun writing about Theresa May eating chips in the street. And the point is that this does actually indicate a couple of the sort of big topics of the module. One is identity, and the other is this idea, as you say, of performing identities. In other words, identity is not all about who we are, as if we're fixed, like a flavour of the month, but about also what we do. And to perform an identity successfully, I'm distracted because there seem to be messages coming in.
Yeah, we do. We've got some messages. Can we answer some questions?
Oh,
Sophie?
right.
We just had a really good question in from Steve. He's asking, would positive psychologists agree with some other psychologists, such as Daniel Nettle, who suggests that happiness may be unachievable and the best we can strive for is mild contentment?
Well, we've taken, I mean, another of our big words is critique, and we have taken a very critical view to social psychology, but to positive psychology. But Paul, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually that's probably a good one for David. I'm passing it over because famously Freud remarked about taking psychoanalysis to the States when he went.
His very cheerful statement. Freud had this very cheerful statement that what we can achieve in therapy, I mean, this is years and years and years of therapy, to substitute historical misery with common unhappiness. So that was his cheerful vision of society. That's how much we can achieve, to just have this common unhappiness.
Oh, great. Well, we'll look forward to that then. So, Stephanie, this blog is something that students can engage with, and do take a look at that. And again, very interesting. And I guess this would really appeal to a lot of students who early days are very interested in identity and this idea about performing identity. And this is a chance to explore that in a lot more detail, looking at a lot more of the ways that can be applied.
Well, we look at it in relation to, as I say, identity not as purely individual, but this social individual interface, and the way that social expectations shape and limit how we can perform certain identities. I mean, the classic point is, how difficult is it for a woman to perform a senior authoritative political role, given that there are few attached ideas about that. The kind of blueprint for how to do it well is not really very well established. We touch on that briefly, but we talk with more seriousness than Theresa May eating chips. We talk about gender, about the expectations which are currently attached to gender, and these have changed. Womanness, manness carry different expectations now, and there may be difficulties for some people in performing certain identities. We have a wonderful interview with Rosalind Gill where she talks about the constraints that are on young women today in a post-feminist environment. Interesting idea that our social world is one in which we all know or think we know what feminism is, what feminist ideas are. So how does that come back and impact on our gender identities? And we look also, my own particular interest, in a somewhat different area, which is worker identities, being a good worker. And in fact, many of our ideas about work and working and a working life actually date back a bit to a sort of arrangement which was never everybody's arrangement and is now really relatively few people, where work is contained within the workplace, fixed working hours, and home is a completely different place, possibly with a different person in charge of it. And we consider, okay, how has being a good worker changed? We've got concepts like being entrepreneurial now. And how does this idea, this expectation about being a good worker, how does it come back in the form of, well, what Paul's talked about, humaneering, the kind of ways that we discipline ourselves, we teach ourselves to be different, to be maybe more entrepreneurial. And this is part of what we call subjectification, the making of subjectivity.
Stephanie, there's so much in there, and that's all we've got time for, but you've given us a wonderful flavour about some of the issues and topics and ways of doing things in the module. So David, Paul and Stephanie, thank you very much for joining me today. You can find out more about the module by looking at the resources page on the website and also study at the OU. We'll be back in a few minutes.
Blog.
Oh yes, and the blog, of course, as well. We'll be back in a few minutes. We're just going to show you the start of one of the videos from A344, and then we will be back in our next session in a couple of minutes. See you soon.